You have your plants and you're ready to put them in the garden. What could possibly go wrong? Well, actually quite a few things. Join me today as I share with you 10 common mistakes when transplanting into the garden. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and these are just some of the many plants that I'm going to be transplanting into my garden this season. And it's quite a variety. Here's a hydrangea that I rescued from the clearance bin of one of my local garden centers. And I've got these violas that I started from seed. They've been growing in my basement, as have these yew plants that I started from cuttings. All of these plants have been growing in a protected environment of one type or another, either in a nursery like with these hydrangea or with these fruit bushes on the other side, or with the mini plants that I've been growing in my basement. They haven't been exposed to the outdoors yet, and this is where the first mistake comes in. We need to harden off our plants. We need to get them ready for the outdoors, and specifically ready for our garden. And if we rush the process too much, which too many of us do, we can really cause damage to our plants, maybe even kill them. And after all the work I've gone into in growing this yarrow, the last thing I want to do is rush it outside too quickly and expose it either to too much sun or too much cold or too much wind and have it run into some issues. Hardening off can really make the difference between giving a plant a good start because it's acclimated to the outdoors or stressing it to the point that it might be stunted. And I think one of the reasons that we fail to harden off like we should is because it takes time, and many of us don't have the patience, which also leads to why the second mistake is often made. We don't have the patience to wait. This bed, that bed, all of these beds are ready for planting in my garden. But I'm about 3 weeks away from my last frost date. The weather is beautiful today, and I'm expecting another great day tomorrow, and the day after that we'll probably have record-setting heat. But it's not time to plant yet. I need to look at my last frost date. I need to look at the forecast. And by looking a little farther out, I can see that next week I've got rain and the possibility of snow returning to my area. So even though today would be a great day to plant, it's important not to plant too soon. Look at that weather forecast, anticipate why the last frost date can be a limitation, and just have some patience to get your plants in the ground. But don't wait too long, because that's another mistake many of us make. We're waiting for that perfect day to put our plants in the ground, where the conditions are just right. But what happens when that day isn't perfect? Sometimes you've got to put the plants in the ground when the conditions are good or all right. Because if we're waiting too long, the plant is continuing to grow in that pot or container. And if we're waiting to put it in the ground, well, at some point, there's no more room for the roots to grow. And the plant becomes root bound, and it could become stunted. It could actually begin a decline in the health of the plant. And you've probably seen this if you've bought plants late in the season at a garden center. It's just roots in that pot, and the plant is on clearance because it isn't doing well. So look at your last frost date, look at the forecast, and get the plants in the ground as soon as you can. Don't wait for that perfect day. And in our enthusiasm to finally get the plants in the ground when we've decided that the day is good enough, we run into the fourth mistake that's commonly made, and that's that we damage our plants. And this can take many forms. With younger, smaller seedlings, you have to be careful that you don't grab the plant by the stem. Believe it or not, the stem is actually one of the weakest points in very young plants. Instead, you should try to remove the plants from the pot and use the root ball. Transport using the roots as much as possible, or grab the plant from the leaves. And if you're supporting the plant with the leaves and the root ball, you can move it into the spot for transplanting. But be careful when you're holding the top of the plant, because there are many of the things that we grow that if you break off that growing tip, the plant isn't going to be able to grow anymore. This is very common in plants like tomatoes. It has a single growing tip. Now it might send out suckers from the other leaves, but if you break off that tip, it's not going to continue growing from that point. And as we're moving it with the roots, be careful that you're not disrupting the roots too much. You've probably seen videos or you've read about spreading apart the roots when you transplant. Well, I don't think that's always the best technique. Sure, if it's root bound, you're going to have to separate some of those roots because maybe they were growing in circles in the pot. But for most of the plants that we have early in the season and most of the plants that we're growing from seed, you don't need to disrupt the roots. Try to keep that root ball as intact as possible, and that will benefit the plant. Just like breaking off the tip can prohibit some future growth, breaking off some of those root tips can do the same. And while it's good to place most of the focus on the plants while we're thinking about transplanting, we also need to think about our garden, specifically the garden beds and the soil within those beds. Because that's another common mistake, is not preparing the soil ahead of time. I prepared the soil in this bed last fall, and the soil in that bed is prepared 6 weeks before I'm planning on putting any plants into it. To get the best success with your plants, you really want good, rich, nutrient-filled, well-draining soil. And the way to do that is to really encourage the soil organisms to do most of the work for you. So, by amending the beds and then giving them time to develop that soil life, you will have better success with your transplants. I don't think it's a good idea to kind of ignore the soil, put the plant in, and then ask the question, what kind of fertilizer should I use? That's like closing the barn door after the horse has escaped. Think about it ahead of time. Get your soil ready weeks before you transplant if you can, and your plants will be better for it. Hardening off our plants will prepare them for our outdoor conditions. But the act of transplanting is very stressful on plants. So the next mistake that's too often made is that we transplant at the wrong time of day. Even though these plants are used to sunlight and cool night conditions by the time I put them in my garden, they're not ready to be transplanted during the height of the day with the most heat and the most sun. That's very stressful on plants, and you're adding stress to an already stressful situation. So instead, you should think about putting your plants in at a cooler time of day. I like to put my plants in very late afternoon or early evening. After it's cooled down, ideally in an area that's already starting to get shade as the sun is beginning to set, or on an overcast day when it's nice and cloudy and the sun is diffused, because that stress of transplanting is relieved a little bit. It's cooler conditions, and now the plants have all night to recover and begin growing. And then in the coolness and then gradual increase of heat in the morning, the plants have had often at least 18 hours in the ground before they're exposed to the really harsh conditions of the sun. As a secondary method, I would plant during the early morning. So again, the plant is in the ground and starting to grow before it's exposed to those harsh conditions. And when you're finally ready to get the plant in the ground, pay special attention to the level of the soil in the pot, because the top of the soil in the pot should match with the soil surface in the location you're putting the plant. Too often, we plant too deep or not deep enough. especially if you grow a lot of tomatoes. Well, we know that you plant tomatoes deeply because the roots will grow along the stem that's buried, but that's not the case with most of the plants that we're growing in our garden. The soil level in the pot should match the ground. And if it's too deep or not deep enough, you can run into problems. And I'm actually talking about the soil, because in this area where I've got my fruit trees and I'll be planting a lot of fruit bushes to start developing a food forest, I have a couple inches of mulch. And so when I put the plant in the ground, I need to match the soil levels, not the surface level. So if I were to put this in where it's matched with the top of the mulch, well, as these roots start to grow, many of them are going to have to grow into the mulch, which doesn't have many nutrients and is probably going to harm those roots. Instead, I need to plant it with the proper level so that the roots are growing into the soil, and I'll adjust the mulch around it. Avoid being too deep or not deep enough, and your plants will have better results. And after you get the plants in the ground, avoid over-fertilizing. That's another very common mistake. If you've taken the time like I have, where you prepare the soil with a lot of organic matter and maybe worked in a slow-release fertilizer, then you don't need any fertilizer at all when you transplant. Too often we have this mindset that these young plants need all the help we can give them, so we're going to fertilize. Well, over-fertilizing can lead to problems with the plant. The soil should feed the plant, not whatever we're fertilizing with. So get your soil ready to go. Anticipate the nutrient levels within your soil, and consider doing a soil test so you know if there's any deficiencies in nutrients. If your soil is good and you don't have those deficiencies, well, then don't fertilize. And when you do fertilize, well, give the plant a chance to start growing. If it's just been put into the ground and we give it a lot of nitrogen, it's going to send up a lot of green shoots and green leaves, and the root system may not have developed enough to support all that new leaf growth. Give the plant some time to get established in the soil, and then recognize if there's a nutrient deficiency and only fertilize to improve upon that deficiency and give the soil what it needs. And when the plant is finally in the ground, water it. Water it well. Give it a good drink. Another mistake is that we underwater our transplants when we first put them in the ground. You need to think ahead. Just like preparing the soil so it's got the nutrients, it should be evenly moist when you transplant. Too often, and I've made this mistake, we don't water our bed for days or weeks before transplanting. We just dig a hole, put the plant in, and those roots that might be 6 or 8 inches deep are in a dry soil environment. Well, we're just adding stress to the plant. So if you transplant into moist soil, you're helping the plant a little right off the bat. And by giving it a good soaking, well, now you're allowing the soil to settle down around those roots. And so the roots are in that moist soil, and they've had that burst of water during a stressful situation. And the roots can get to work right away to support the plant. It's easy to overwater, but in the beginning, when you first put the plants in, it's more likely that you're going to underwater. So soak those plants, give them the drink, then after that point you can check the soil moisture levels to avoid overwatering beyond that. And so the plants are in the ground and you've done everything right up to this point. It's so easy to just clean off your hands and say, okay, good, now I'll take care of the plant. Well, don't forget about the pests that you have in your garden that are very happy that you've put some fresh food into the garden. You need to anticipate those potential problems. The problem is actually corrected with experience after you've lost a number of plants and figure out you have pests in your garden. And the pests could range from insects to birds to dogs that you allow to walk across your bed. Anticipate those kind of problems. If it's an insect pest, learn about the insects you have in your garden. And you might be able to put a cloth row cover over your young seedlings so that the insects can't get to your plants and they can be allowed to grow to the point they can fight off those pests. If it's an animal pest, you might want to put bird netting or some type of fence or barrier around the bed so that those animals can't get to the plants. Don't make that mistake. Keep thinking about the plants. You cared for them if you were growing them from seed under lights. We'll continue to care for them during that critical first growth phase until they can tend for themselves a little bit better. Anticipate that you're going to make that mistake and you're going to need to learn how to correct it before it ever happens. Now, I do have some videos on some of these subjects that go into much more detail, and I suggest that you look at one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.